Hello and welcome to the second edition of Progressum TV, where we will discuss and analyze and maybe even mock all the news and all the people making the news who are worth talking about. In this edition, we're going to go back to a recurrent theme, a theme that I've discussed on numerous occasions in the early pre-Progressum shows that I have up online, and that is the handful of Democratic senators who are basically holding up any attempt to create a progressive agenda under the presidency of Joe Biden. Now, there's always one name that comes to mind, and that is Joe Manchin. If you don't know who Joe Manchin is, he is a senator from West Virginia who is known for basically being a Republican in a Democratic outfit. He largely sides with, he's one of the senators who most commonly sides with Republican proposals. He is also one of the senators who most often has no problem derailing whatsoever any sort of Democratic legislation that is even remotely progressive. I mean, he's not of the left in any way. He's clearly from the right, and he justifies this from the fact that he is a senator from a very conservative state, West Virginia, which is true, and that he must listen to his constituents rather than the general ideology of the Democratic Party, if you believe that it is left, which I don't. Lately, there's been another senator who has joined Joe Manchin as also being kind of this face of the Democratic Party's right wing, and that is Kyrsten Sinema. She is a senator from Arizona, and she is most famous, or dare I say most notorious, for the way in which she voted down the attempt to include a minimum wage of $15, an increase of the minimum wage to $15 during the stimulus bill negotiations. She famously walked up near the podium and gave a thumbs down in a very sort of condescending and mocking way, and she was rightfully criticized by that in the media. And, well, now she's anyone even remotely doubting that she and Manchin are not on the side of working people, as the Democratic Party claims that it is the fact that now they're going to headline an event for an anti-union group that has claimed to be one of the main responsible parties for the $15 minimum wage not passing. And that is the National Restaurant Association, which is known by its acronym NRA, not to be confused with another very famous right-wing lobby group, the National Rifle Association. So I think this is an acronym that always stands for something pretty awful and pretty vile. So here's the news from the Daily Poster. I'm gonna read some bits. So, weeks after voting to kill a $15 minimum wage, Senators Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin will headline the national conference of the restaurant lobbying group that led the battle to block the wage increase and is fighting a separate Democratic measure to make it easier for workers to form unions. They will also be joined by disgraced former Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, another classic sort of establishment Democrat, who spends more time fighting the progressive wing of his party rather than the actual far-right Republican Party. Now, they've apparently weren't even in the original event schedule, as the report mentions. So it's really, it's telling how much they're making them, how much they're pushing themselves to be the face of this opposition to the minimum wage or any other kind of pro-worker legislation, because, as has been mentioned, this is also a group that is fighting that is fighting unions, fighting potential legislation that is attempting to make it easier to form unions, which, as we know during the recent Amazon union vote in Alabama, is very hard in the U.S. Organizing a union is incredibly hard. You face consistent opposition from your employer. They do everything they can, including, firing people, rabble rousers who are trying to form the union, forcing people into having meetings with staff where they give essentially anti-union propaganda. These are not fair elections in any way, and I've already spoken about that in a previous video. So now these people have a history of accepting donations from very dodgy groups, and this partly explains why they are so hesitant to endorse any of this progressive legislation. Again, I will read what this article says. Sinema recently received donations from political action committees for Barnes & Thornburg, Cozen O'Connor, and Steptoe & Johnson, 3 law firms that advertise their services helping corporations halt union drives among workers. Data compiled by Open Secrets show that during Sinema's career, her 7th largest collective source of campaign money has been contributions from Snell and Wilmer, a law firm whose website says it has, quote, advertised clients and provided management training on lawful union-avoiding strategies, strikes, union corporate campaigns, and litigations with unions. Steptoe and Johnson is also a major donor for Joe Manchin, as this article also explains. So there you go. That's the people who are backing these illustrious Democratic senators. And the irony is that, so the NRA is essentially a lobbying firm for the restaurant industry, but what they're basically advocating goes against what they themselves believe, or what major restaurant chains actually believe would be the effect of the minimum wage. And again, this is a topic that I already spoke about in a previous video, but it's worth rehashing with the same article. This is from Newsweek. And the article is, McDonald's and other CEOs tell investors $15 minimum wage won't hurt businesses. And basically what this article points out is that while in public, many of these companies and many of their CEOs claim to make it look like the $15 minimum wage is going to be a threat to their business model, a threat to their profits, they're going to end up firing people, the typical right-wing spiel regarding the minimum wage, largely debunked by economics, I should add. But apparently they say something completely different to investors. And so in calls to investors, they've admitted that actually, because obviously if you're an investor in this company, you want to know, well, if a $15 minimum wage is going to pass, well, what's going to be the effect on this business? And you can't really lie to them because they are the people who are basically giving you money. So during these calls, they actually admit that, in fact, the minimum wage won't really affect them in many ways. Here's one from Denny's. Gradual increases in the minimum wage haven't been a problem for the company at all. In fact, California's law raising the minimum wage to $15 by 2023 has actually been good for the diner chain's businesses. So there you have it. They're telling investors one thing, they're telling the public another thing entirely different. So let's be honest, this is basically just, plutocracy in action. These are senators who supposedly, they wear the badge of a party that supposedly is the one that stands for workers, but in reality, this is who they're serving. They are serving the major restaurant corporations when they oppose something like a $15 minimum wage. And if they continue to oppose anti-union legislation, well, they're basically just telling the workers of the United States to go fuck themselves. So I need to talk about this because it's important to mention them in the wider context. So why are people like Sinema and Manchin important? And the answer is they're not. So the argument that a lot of people, and I've seen this from a lot of uh, Democratic establishment defenders and Biden defenders, that, well, they can't really do anything about Manchin because, he's a Democrat. He's a Democrat in a very Republican state. When else are we going to get someone? You can't run an AOC and expect her to win in West Virginia because it's a very conservative state, and that is true. In a very conservative state like West Virginia, you probably need a very conservative person running on your ticket, even if you're supposedly not the Conservative Party running. But this ignores a couple of things. So basically, the question is whether Manchin is useful now and whether he will be useful in the future. So the reason why Manchin is not useful now is because he's actively derailing Biden's major policies. I mean, it's kind of lucky that he didn't derail the stimulus bill, which he actually verbally opposed at the beginning. And I believe he said that he wasn't going to vote for it unless there were Republicans who voted for it as well. In the event he did, but he derailed the minimum wage component of it. He now has some issues with some of the infrastructure project. He will basically, anytime that any Democratic legislation is going to cross the threshold, dip its toes into any progressive ideal, he's going to derail it. And he has the power, because if you're going to pass these bills through the reconciliation process, which is the easiest one because you only need 50 votes, well, he's the kingmaker. He is. The Democrats don't have a margin to ignore Manchin, much less if Sinema also joins Manchin in opposing these things. So now you have two. You basically only have 48 kind of guaranteed votes, and it's not true actually. There's a couple of others who have been. It was 4 people I think who voted against the minimum wage bill. So here's the thing: he's not useful to you now, and he's also not going to be useful for you in the future. Why? Because in 2022, 2 things will happen. Either you're going to increase the amount of senators that you have. Let's say if the Democrats do really, really well, and they increase their share of Democratic lawmakers in the Senate, well, guess what, Manchin? You're no longer important. Screw you. Because if they have a margin of, more than 2, more than 4, then yeah, he's irrelevant. He's absolutely irrelevant. You can kick him out of the party if you want. Now, the other more likely scenario is actually that Democrats lose seats. Why? Because most incumbent parties tend to do bad during the midterms. We saw this during the Clinton years in 1994, the Republican Revolution led by people like Newt Gingrich, who basically swept Congress. And we had a repeat of that during the Obama years in 2010, when again the Republicans swept through Congress. So Democrats still haven't learned the lesson that if they're not bold enough with their proposals, that they're going to get their butts kicked. Why? Because people, I think, expect more from them. I think the people who vote Republican know that this is a party that now is basically just kind of a culture war, social conservatism party, but they don't represent any sort of structural change, and I think the people who vote for them don't really expect them to. But people expect the Democrats to do it. So when they don't deliver, they get punished more than Republicans do. And rightfully so, I would say. So if the Democrats suffer another major reverse during the 2022 midterms, guess what? Manchin is also not going to be important, because now you won't control the Senate at all. So you basically wasted 2 years in which you caved into these 2 cretins when you could have done one of 2 things. You could have, and this is what, if I was Biden, this is what I would do. I will sit down with them and I will tell them, hey, Joe, talking to you man to man, Joe to Joe, if you don't support my agenda, I'm going to primary your ass in 2022, and I will support whoever runs against you, and I will be on the stage with that person primarying you, and you probably will lose, because when a president supports a candidate, it makes a big deal. It makes a difference. And he can say the same to Sinema, and he can tell them, you know what? I don't really need your seat, because we're gonna try to increase our representation in the Senate. We're gonna do our best in other campaigns, and you're basically gonna be irrelevant. And at some point, he either caves in, or at least you made the effort. And worst case scenario, just kick him out of the party. I mean, he's of no use whatsoever if Biden intends to pass his agenda. However, the reason why this doesn't happen is really why I actually think that people like him and Sinema have a function. They serve a purpose to the Democratic Party, and that is that the majority of Democrats can basically pretend to be progressive. Biden can pretend that he has this groundbreaking new agenda, evoking FDR, evoking the New Deal, when he really has no intention of passing it, when he knows that it will be derailed and that other people can take the blame and that he can act like he tried. And I think Biden's record, his ideological record, is consistent with him not really being a progressive in any way. So I think, this is not a conspiracy theory. This is from what I see and what many other people see in the way that Biden and the Democratic establishment has behaved with respect with their dealings to people like Joe Manchin and Sinema. And the fact that there's no pressure on them to toe the party line really says a lot, and it really makes me think that this is just fluff. These are great ideas that they expect to be watered down. They know they're not going to pass the way they're proposing it, but then they can blame someone like Manchin for them not passing. So we'll see. I hope I'm wrong. I do hope, for the sake of the American workers and the American people, that it does pass, that these things do pass. But I'll believe it when I see it. Now, our second point of the day is so there's a show that I like. I recommend it to most people. It's Rising in the Hill. It's hosted by Crystal Ball, who is a well-known Bernie Sanders surrogate. I find it funny, the use of that word, surrogate. You're like a mother to their ideas. But yeah, she was very close to Bernie Sanders. And her co-host is a guy called Sagar Enjeti. Now, Sagar, the whole point of this show, Rising, is that you have someone who is very left, very pro-Bernie, and someone who is rather pro-Trump. Because Sagar is basically a right-wing populist. He is kind of a Tucker Carlsonite. The idea of this show is to put two people who are basically anti-establishment on the same table, discussing anti-establishment issues from a left and right perspective. And what's often disturbing about... Now, I said that I recommend this show, and I recommend it because you will definitely get a different gist about what is wrong with the US if you see The Hill than if you see the mainstream media, that being CNN, MSNBC, to say nothing of Fox News. Why? Because channels like CNN and MSNBC don't really challenge the status quo. They focus excessively, during the 4 years of Trump, they basically just went with the whole orange man bad spiel and just spoke on and on and on every day about how bad Trump was, and just never seemed to discuss why people voted for Trump, why people supported Trump, because they don't want to discuss that. They don't really see a need to change the status quo. If back to the good old days of the Obama administration, that's kind of what they're the kind of policies that they're defending. So it's very weak analysis. It's very it's non-threatening. I think that's the best way to describe it. It is non-threatening. And I personally don't like any political analysis that is non-threatening, because in countries where you have serious structural issues, defending the status quo is not a way to resolve them in any way. But on the other hand, anti-establishment for the sake of being anti-establishment is equally stupid. Why? Because you end up in this vicious cycle of anti-establishmentizing each other. And I see this a lot on Twitter. I see this a lot with many leftists, especially those who I would describe as tankies. Basically, there is a race to see, who is the most anti-establishment of them all. And when your political views are shaped by what you oppose more than what you believe in, it's not ideology. You're basically just an ideologue. And you can tell very easily when people are the type that mostly just criticize without describing what they believe in, right? So you have people who are just basically anti-capitalist, anti-Western imperialism, anti-this, anti-American hegemony, anti-this, and then they end up defending China, defending Russia, practically apologizing for any genocide or any oppression that these countries commit. And that's because they don't stand for anything. So everything is good if it's your side that's doing it. And that means you stand for nothing. And consequently, from the right as well. The anti-establishment right is basically the Trump base. And this is, a very conspiratorial, you're anti-vaccines because it's the evil pharmaceuticals who are doing it. You're anti-immigration, you're anti-China because China is clearly doing everything that's wrong in the world. So I think the Hill, Rising in the Hill, is a good show, but one that you need to basically take with a pinch of salt, and one in which you sometimes kind of have to put your tinfoil hat on, or something to sort of deflect. I say this metaphorically because actually that means you're a conspiracy theorist. But what I mean is basically you need to question it. You need to just not take it ad verbatim. So here's a good example of when the Hill crosses that line, and it's regarding the conspiracy theory that the coronavirus was made in a lab. Now, I'll start by saying we cannot discount any possibility. But here's how this is defended, and I think what's really problematic about this is that you rarely see Crystal and Sagar disagree, despite the fact that they are from the complete opposite ends of the political spectrum. The only thing that they have in common is their anti-establishment tendencies. It is very disturbing when they agree. And it's very disturbing, in other episodes, for example, when they agree with Tucker Carlson, of all people, who is essentially a mouthpiece for white supremacists, which no leftist should ever support. So let's see this video where they discuss the possibility that coronavirus was made in a lab. a Chinese lab, of course.
Really interesting moment, Dr. Sanjay Gupta of CNN. Not exactly.
Slight error with the speakers. This should work.
A fringe voice coming out and saying that he believes there is credence, as in not dismissible, the idea that COVID-19 leaked out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Let's take a listen to what he said.
He is an experienced virologist.
He's an experienced virologist. He was also head of the CDC at the time this was happening, which means that in addition to everything that we know, he had access to raw data and raw intelligence that was coming out of China. My point is that it's a much more informed sort of thing for him to be saying than for, anybody who may have expertise in virology, because he has a lot more knowledge and information that he has that maybe he can't share, but is informing his opinion.
I think it's
So they're discussing the possibility that someone with knowledge of the possibility that coronavirus was actually created in a Wuhan lab. But this person clearly hasn't shared that information. So we're still not anywhere near arriving at a definitive conclusion that it was made in a lab, which I think is really, if you're going to make a segment on whether it's made in a lab or not, you better have something, like, this is weak. Like, you better have something better than, oh, this guy with authority, ex-CDC director, hasn't shared information that he has. Thus, there's a possibility that it was made in a lab. Like, that is flimsy. But that's what basically this whole segment is basing itself on.
Important that Sanjay Gupta is backing up Dr. Redfield on this, because Dr. Redfield took a lot of heat. It was like, oh, he's embracing this Trumpian conspiracy theory, etc. He's the former head of the CDC. Okay, and the more that we begin to see a lot of the evidence come out, the WHO, their cover-up, I covered there, about how the only American investigator on the team is the person who funded the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and was like, and it was blatantly asked, so you just believe them? And he goes, yeah, what else are you supposed to do? I don't know. I mean, a lot more investigation?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's another thing. So he's basically... The way the sort of conspiracy works is, as I said, you don't exactly have the evidence that it was made in a lab, just the possibility that it was made in a lab. Someone of international repute, which this guy, ex-head of the CIA, says that there is a possibility, but there's still no evidence. You're still not actually, give us something. Is there, there are techniques where you can determine whether they're not entirely reliable. Presumably if you bioengineered a virus, a major state like China, like Russia, which I assume have biological warfare capabilities, could probably engineer a virus. But at the same time, there are techniques, there are forensic, biological forensic techniques that you can use. And there's been many articles that have come out that kind of explain how a lot of these, in the US, for example, they've tried to use intelligence analysis and biological analysis to see if the virus had any hint that it was engineered by humans. And the result is that they couldn't find any. They found lots of suggestions that the virus, shares genetic code with other similar viruses. And so the logical implication that the virus basically was created in nature by some animal, probably a bat, then passed on to humans. This is how most viruses eventually reach humans, through animals. And we have heard for many, many years that the more we destroy our environment, the more we are in contact with parts of nature that we were previously not in contact with, raises the risks that one of those viruses will jump into people. And why China? Well, China happens to be the most populated country in the world. So if there is going to be one country where more people are exposed to animals, it is China. There's nothing strange about this. This is just very simple math. What's the most populous country in the world? China. And the other thing that, okay, so I understand that the fact that there was a virology institute in Wuhan does make it sound very suspicious that the virus appeared in Wuhan. If in the US an epidemic started near Atlanta, people would probably think, hey, CDC happens to be in Atlanta. Is there a link? And it could be. But still, here's the thing. Wuhan just so happens to be, if you look at a map of China, Wuhan is very much at like the western edge of the major population areas of China. So the more west you go from Wuhan, the more nature there is. Wuhan is kind of at that edge. So it's not surprising that you're basically in a city that is closer to nature than, say, Shanghai is, because Shanghai or Beijing are basically just surrounded by other cities and other towns. Again, this would be the same case in the US. If, for example, there was a disease that was found in maybe Denver, that would be slightly more plausible than if it had emerged in Boston, because Boston is surrounded by other cities, or New York or DC, whereas Denver is near the Rocky Mountains. There are no major metropolitan areas around it. There is forest, there is nature, there are animals around there. So I think that explains a bit, it isn't the defining reason, but if there is probably a reason why it emerged in Wuhan, aside from the fact that there's a virology institute there, I think it's because Wuhan is kind of at the outer edges of China's major urban cores. So anyway, let's see what else they say.
That was wild. You played that out where he's like, we just believed them what they said. We asked tough questions and then we accepted their answers. Like, that's all. That's what you did. Crazy.
Yeah, no, it's.
So this is where I think Crystal Ball is like not helping, and because the intention of both is to basically present the establishment as the enemy, she's basically just following along what is a slightly more detailed version of a Trumpian conspiracy theory, which he admits, which Sagar admits. It's like, yeah, Trump used to give these. Did he say this, or does he say it later in the video? I don't know. But he basically goes on and tells, well, this is what Trump was saying all along. It's the China virus. But yeah, there's just no questioning. This whole segment, this 5-minute segment, there is no questioning whatsoever from Crystal Ball on anything that Sagar says.
It's pretty nuts. I do think that the more, and this is always the problem with Trump, right? Like Trump would dial it up to 12 and be like, it came from China. And then people reflexively would be like, no, it didn't. It becomes a culture war.
Yeah.
And the longer he's off the scene, more people who are faced with facts are like, hey, look, like when Sanjay Gupta defends Dr. Redfield and Dr. Redfield comes out and says this, when the New York Times, when Anthony Blinken, Biden's own Secretary of State, says he doesn't trust the WHO report, I don't think there's any ground for people to stand on who say that.
So here's the thing. The WHO has been wrong. We all know this. This is not a conspiracy theory. The WHO has given very, bad advice, has basically downplayed the pandemic at the start, and there's a reason for this as well, and that is because, well, the WHO is like any other major international institution. It has to play diplomacy. It can't just be like a politics-free, although it probably claims that it is. It can't really act in a way that is alien to politics. And what does that mean? it means you basically have to play nice to people. You can't really like criticize China's initial response to the pandemic, which was really bad. They can't really do that, especially when it's a big country, and especially when presumably that country partly funds you. Same with the US, same with major Western countries. So they can't really do that. They can't play like the global critic of pandemic responses and pandemic policies. So the WHO has gotten a lot of things wrong. Now, the WHO is essentially an advisory organization for countries, for the big countries. I mean, the US does not have to follow what the WHO says or does. And in fact, Trump said that the US was going to withdraw from the WHO. Big countries have their domestic health policies, and they don't have to listen to WHO recommendations. So regardless of whatever WHO report has been wrong, equating that's the trick that they're doing. They're equating, since the WHO has gotten things wrong, thus the possibility of a conspiracy is true. And that's an argumentative fallacy, because the WHO could be wrong on everything. That still doesn't prove the conspiracy that the coronavirus was made in China. For that, you need facts that are directly related to whether it was made in China. Either intelligence evidence that this lab was working on coronaviruses and that somehow it escaped, or evidence from the bioengineering of, show evidence that there was bioengineering of the virus, which they haven't found. And you can Google this.
It's a quote-unquote dismissed, debunked conspiracy theory like the New York Times. And when the New York Times is...
So yes, it is debunked. Every conspiracy is debunked by default until you prove it true. In fact, any idea is debunked until he's playing the burden of proof argument. He's flipping it. He's making the people who believe that it's a conspiracy, it makes them have the burden of proof of debunking it, and that's not how it works. It's the other way around.
Own paper is the one which is publishing an open letter from scientists like Jamie Metzel saying, no, this Wuhan Institute of Virology theory is absolutely should be considered, and the WHO investigation is bunk. They just don't have a lot of ground to stand on right now.
Trump made it sound like this was like intentionally unleashed by the Chinese government to destroy us. And obviously, like, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about an accidental leak from the Wuhan lab of virology, which is incredibly plausible and has not been debunked or ruled out.
Again, she's clearly has no different notion of burden of proof than Sagar. And that is why I often think that this show really needs a bit more debate between the two. And Crystal needs to agree less to the crazy shit that Sagar mentions. Because you can't just repeat the same argument that the burden of proof is in the people who are willing to debunk. Now, this is not to say that there shouldn't be an investigation. Every possibility is there. We do think that China had a lot of responsibility in contributing to how the virus basically left China. That they didn't do enough from the start. That is true. So China does need to. There needs to be an inquiry. There are questions to be made. But this argument that there is a possibility that it leaked from the lab, that it must be investigated, well, sure, investigate it. But don't make a segment where you're basically passing it off as almost truth, because this almost sounds, that they're not insisting that it's just a possibility. They're practically affirming it. Why? Because they just had CNN's medical expert, Sanjay Gupta, and using him as an authority of why they think this is a plausible explanation.
regardless of how many times the mainstream media continues to repeat that line. Nobody knows for sure, but it's insane that you can't ask the question. It's insane that you're not allowed to investigate it. And it's completely insane to just take the WHO report at its word when it's compromised in all the ways that you've made so incredibly plain. Trump gave the people who have an interest in hiding the true origins of what happened here, he gave them the greatest gift they ever could have.
Because now they're like, well, Trump said it's a conspiracy.
Right, because he takes it to that place that is insane and wild. They get to then use that to say, no, if you're a serious person, if you're a decent person, if you're a non-racist person, then we have to accept this other explanation, even though, again, we just haven't seen the proof that it really did come from bats or develop from nature. So
the proof is the fact that there is no evidence of bioengineering. That is the proof. All viruses are assumed to come from nature until proven otherwise. Jesus Christ, this isn't hard. And also note how they play on the culture war now, because now they've turned it into basically anti-Trumpism. You believe that it's not made in a lab because you hate Trump. And that's also not how it works. I think you have to believe the story that it was made in a lab, independently, or not believe that it was made in a lab, independently of whether you believe Trump or not. And you would expect that a show which I take it they are geared towards an above average intelligence audience would do a better job of giving the reasons why this is not really, this shouldn't be the big focus, because in the end as well, let's assume that they did leak it. Even by accident, that changes nothing. People died. If it's revealed that it was an accidental leak, it's going to be a massive, massive, massive embarrassment for China and for the Communist Party of China. So it's clearly not in their interest to do something like this. If it was done on purpose or if it was accidental, it'll come back and haunt them a lot. But yeah, that's all I'm going to mention from this video. But this is how you basically twist burden of proof. And it reminded me a lot of the sort of naughties, atheist versus religious debates that you had back then, where religious people would always try and shift the burden of proof of whether God is real onto atheists, which is not how it works. So again, this is a show that I mostly recommend. They have some really good material, but you have to really, this is really why, like any media, you shouldn't be committed to them. You should question everything. Because even if you like what they say most of the time, there'll be times they'll be wrong. And just because you like them doesn't mean that you have to agree with them when they're wrong. And Rising does this a lot, so that's what you have to weigh in when you're watching it. But still, it's a good show. So now that we're on the topic of coronavirus, let's talk about vaccines. Recently, the FDA paused the application of the Johnson & Johnson one-shot vaccine due to concerns that it raised the risk of blood clots. This is similar to what happened with the AstraZeneca vaccine, which many European countries temporarily suspended its use until the risk factors were weighed in. It turns out that there is, even though this risk is low, it is statistically significant. That is, it cannot be explained by other factors. It happens at a rate clearly higher than the general population. So it is a medically significant statistic. Now, here's the thing. This particular blood clot is a very specific blood clot. It's not your run-of-the-mill blood clot. It's called a cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, which is a blood clot in the dural venous sinuses, or the cerebral veins. So the symptoms are very similar to a normal clot, but thankfully it appears that the prognosis is slightly better than a normal clot. So according to Wikipedia, the fatality rate of this type of blood clot is 8.3%, which is even lower, 5.6% if it's in a hospital setting. Now, a normal clot is estimated to kill 1 in 8, and it's estimated to kill 1 in 4 over the course of the year after the clot. So it's way more serious than this specific type of clot, which apparently is also very rare in the general population. This is not a common clot, and it happens a lot in young people as well, which is, again, not usually the case of a normal type of clot, which mostly happens in older people. So those are the facts about this specific kind of clot. Now, here's the thing. Medical policy has to weigh in the pros and the cons of any treatment that it authorizes. And it's a fact that many treatments are, or dare I say, most treatments are not entirely free of some risk, including risk of death. Now, if we were in a situation, and maybe this will be the situation in 2-3 years, where we can walk into a pharmacy, pick the COVID vaccine that we need, because we know that COVID is probably going to be endemic. We're probably not going to get rid of it ever again. But if we have a variety of vaccines, well, we can sort of discard the ones that have bigger risk than the ones that don't. But that is not the case now. Not in the first year of mass vaccination, when we need to vaccinate as quickly as possible the greatest amount of people, so that we can end lockdowns, return to normal, resume any semblance of our pre-COVID lives. So in this case, is the risk big enough to warrant pausing vaccination? I'm not quite sure. So the risk from what I've read, is about 4 in a million people will develop this blood clot. And this is just the people who are going to develop. I think it's just who's going to develop it, not who's going to die. So as you can see, the risk is very low. You only see these cases in, a broad amount, or, only under a situation where you've vaccinated millions of people with this particular vaccine, you will see cases of this very rare type of blood clot. So you have to weigh that in. Is this worth pausing vaccination? I am not quite sure. And what I'm worried about is that the reasons why we're pausing vaccination is because, well, kind of caving in to the conspiracy theorists. How do we know this? Well, turns out that a lot of the people who have basically made these news go viral are conspiracy theorists, of course. So here's an article from NPR. The most popular Johnson & Johnson vaccine story on Facebook, a conspiracy theorist posted it. This is not surprising at all. From the start of the pandemic, the anti-vaxx community has basically tried to pick apart any little mistake that it finds. Whether it's something that the WHO said that was wrong, whether it's something that a national health authority got wrong, any sort of person feeling remotely ill, to say nothing of people who died as a result of a vaccine. This is proof that vaccines don't work, that they all have a microchip made by Bill Gates inside. And as soon as a news story that is negative about vaccines comes out, it spreads like wildfire in the anti-vax communities. Now, there's obviously a big debate on freedom of speech and whether people have the right to share patently false information that can actually hurt people, because this information means that there will be people who will refuse to be vaccinated, which lowers the amount of people that will eventually have herd immunity. And we know that we need a certain amount of people in a population to be vaccinated to have herd immunity, so that the disease has any realistic chance of reducing itself to a manageable level. So, insofar as these news, these posts reduce the amount of people that could get herd immunity, it's a problem. It's a health issue. Of course, who polices this? Is it going to be Facebook? Is it going to be Twitter? Is it going to be, evil big government? We don't know. That's a debate that needs to be had. But I am worried that the more that we focus on the very, very, very low risks that vaccines represent, the more damage that we are generating from people who decide not to get vaccinated because of this. So, there's also another interesting story here, and it is related to, the competition element between the vaccines, specifically the Pfizer and Moderna, as well as Johnson & Johnson. Turns out that Johnson & Johnson privately asked rival COVID-19 vaccine makers to probe clotting risks. And apparently AstraZeneca was also interested. But Pfizer and Moderna didn't see the need for group action. Well, this is not surprising at all. So Pfizer and Moderna so far there's no evidence to suggest that there's any major kind of fatal risks from these vaccines. As you may or may not know, Pfizer and Moderna's are mRNA vaccines, which have a different mechanism than standard adenovirus vaccines like Johnson & Johnson, like AstraZeneca, or like Sputnik. From my experience, not my personal experience because I haven't been vaccinated, but from people who I know personally who have been vaccinated, probably the people who have had the most significant immediate reaction to them have been to Pfizer and Moderna. I have a lot of friends who have really felt just like completely knocked out. And young people, young, fit people who have just been knocked out for a day or two after taking one of these. But, that's, clearly they generate a very violent immune response, an immediate violent immune response, but nothing that is really concerning in the long run. So it's clear here that there is some degree of corporate competition, and there's clearly no interest in Pfizer and Moderna for there to be other successful COVID vaccines besides their own. And this just comes to show, we live in a age where we have the biggest health emergency in human history in terms of its economic impact, not just its human one. In human one we've had worse, but in terms of its economic impact, COVID definitely by far has created the biggest economic dislocation of any pandemic since the Black Death. So we have just had no cooperation. We've had no cooperation between companies. We haven't had no cooperation with companies and international organizations. The idea that we would have an intellectual property waiver for some of these vaccines so that other countries could manufacture it. Well, that didn't happen through efforts led by Bill Gates, I should add, who, contrary to what the conspiracy theories say, he's not putting microchips in your vaccines. He's just preventing poor countries from making vaccines, which I think is much worse. Much, much worse. So he ends up being the villain for all completely different reasons that the conspiracy theorists believed him to be. So I, if I'm a health official, I obviously have to weigh in these risks. These are not easy decisions. You don't want people to die from vaccines. But I think we might be caving in a bit too much to anti-vaxxer hysteria. And certainly, at least from the numbers that we're getting, there is no way of arguing that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine or the AstraZeneca vaccine create more damage, create more death than the deaths that they prevent, which in a year like this, that should be our major focus. And finally, our last bit for today, some good old British news. Keir Starmer was appointed the leader of the opposition in early 2020, following Corbyn's rather disastrous 2009 showing in the December general election. Corbyn had done really well in the 2017 election when he was not expected to close in the gap against the Tories. He nearly won that election. And perhaps a lot of people were expecting him to pull off another 2017 and maybe win it this time. But it turns out he didn't. And that was sort of the last straw, which forced him to call for another leadership election, which Keir Starmer, who used to be the shadow Brexit secretary, eventually won. Now, I had a view of Starmer when he won. I thought Corbyn, so I was a fan of Corbyn's agenda, obviously, as a socialist. I think his agenda, which was largely the intellectual product of John McDonnell, his shadow chancellor, I thought it was really good. I thought it did represent a major structural change to the type of economic policies that Britain had been basically subject to since the Thatcher era, with not much change during Tony Blair's premiership, and which directly have led to the Tories winning since 2017, establishing austerity, reducing the standard of living, and now we have another floppy-haired fascist in power in the name of Boris Johnson. So it was, I thought, I would have assumed that this transformative agenda would have been appealing to enough people, especially people who have been the victims of Tory policy. And by this I mean most people in England outside of London. Because London is sort of an island onto itself, and it kind of insulates itself from the broader malaise of things like Brexit and austerity. But people elsewhere in England and Britain in general have really suffered from Tory austerity, from Tory policies in general, especially people in the north. The north of England is, for those not familiar with British politics and British history, well, the north of England is the old manufacturing heartland of the country. These are the old industrial cities like Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield, Leeds, which have fallen on rough times since the decline of manufacturing since the 70s onward. And there's a massive gap in affluence and prosperity between London, which has been propped up by finance, by services, etc., whereas these other parts of the country have suffered. So it's not surprising that these parts of the country have been historically Labour voters. Unions tended to be strong in the big industrial towns. Unions obviously have ties to the Labour Party. And a phrase that was invented during the 2019 campaign was the Red Wall. The Red Wall is basically, if you look at a map, I'm going to show a map. That's not a real map. So that is basically each hex represents each constituency in all of Britain. So it's just to show sort of the voter size of the country rather than the geographical side, because, obviously the Scottish Highlands are huge, but there's not many people living there. So looks a bit odd. Not the, Scotland has a very tiny head here. But this is the red wall. So this wall of red that you see up here, which is Labour's main bastion, aside from London, and aside from parts of Wales, whereas the rest of the country is highly Tory. Again, much like the US, where the rural vote tends to favor Republicans. Same in Britain. Rural vote tends to favor Tories. So the red wall is one of the reasons why Labour lost in 2019. We had a lot of places, and these were not usually in the cities themselves, but rather the kind of quasi-rural, quasi-urban surrounding areas of the major northern cities that flipped. They went from historically Labour to Tory. And some of them had flips that, they've been basically run by Labour for decades, almost centuries. There were some cases of constituencies that were hadn't voted Tory since the early 20th century, and they flipped. So the fall of the red wall has been basically been described by pundits as the main reason why Labour lost the election, and largely because these are voters who might be left-wing on economics, but they're rather socially conservative, and Corbyn didn't really appeal to them in the way that, strangely, Boris Johnson did, despite the fact that Boris Johnson is, an Eton-educated Tory toff, which has nothing in common with a working man from any part of the red wall. So, what has happened to Starmer? So Corbyn lost. There was some view that, well, even if his, and someone like myself would admit that even though I appreciated his agenda, the fact is Corbyn was a terrible politician, like really bad. He just could not handle the crisis that admittedly were over-exaggerated by the media and by his opponents, sort of the anti-Semitism scandal. He couldn't handle them well, and I think he did a really poor job at this. And it's telling that while it is true that segments of Labour have very strong anti-Semitic tendencies, these are like, this is the tanky side of the Labour Party that just mentally can't separate legitimate criticism of Israel and Israeli policy against Palestinians versus Jewish people, which have nothing to do with what Israel does as a nation. And for a lot of leftists, for especially a lot of hard leftists, which presumably formed a lot of the backbone of the Corbyn movement, this was a problem. And the party definitely did not do enough against this. Of course, one has to weigh why I think this was overblown. It's not because the anti-Semitism issue in itself was not important. I think it was. It's the fact that, well, the Tories have an even worse record on racism, like way, way worse, against every conceivable race that isn't white. And so it seems to me a bit unfair that one party was just tarnished year after year with this one scandal, whereas all the systematic racism that we've seen from the Tory party on immigration policy, on Boris Johnson's comments, that was not an issue. So it's a massive double standard from the media and from the way that we, as voters, kind of choose who we dislike on the basis of what they say. And the left has always faced an uphill struggle in this respect, in that if you imagine the analogy of a football game in which you're facing one of the big football powers, you basically have to play your A game to beat them. You have to play flawlessly to score the upset. Whereas they don't have to play flawlessly to beat you, right? So it's kind of the same when you have an election in this kind of media atmosphere and cultural atmosphere. The left really needs to play a perfect game, and if it doesn't play a perfect game, it'll lose. And it's unfair, yeah, but you have to. There's no way out of it. Complaining about it, and I think that's what a lot of Corbyn supporters did. They just complained about how biased the media was, that it's not fair, and yet they did nothing to kind of correct the mistakes that could have. Because had Corbyn taken a better stance against the anti-Semitism scandal, he may have found a way to kind of not make it part of the national discussion. And he couldn't do it. He just couldn't do it. This and another litany of failures on his part. So, repeating what I said from the start, I think his agenda was good, but I think he was a terrible politician. So, when it turned out that his successor was going to be Keir Starmer, a man who generally did a good job as the shadow Brexit chancellor, he seemed very on point, well-spoken. He seemed perhaps the exact opposite of what Corbyn was. We kind of knew that Keir Starmer didn't really have an ideology behind him. So expecting him to come with a transformative agenda was probably pushing it. But at least if he was a more able and competent politician than Corbyn, then maybe he could do a good job as opposition leader, and hopefully if he were to become prime minister, eventually, the existing leftist forces would kind of help push him towards a more progressive agenda. But in the meantime, just basically anything that isn't Boris Johnson is good. Kind of the same with Biden. I'm not a fan of Joe Biden, but clearly he's better than Trump. And clearly Starmer would be better than Boris Johnson. But here's the thing. He's disappointed. His main strength, which was basically his personality, that he would be a better, more competent politician and leader than Corbyn, has not shown any evidence of being true. So now we're facing the worst of both worlds. We have someone who doesn't have an agenda, which at least Corbyn did have, and someone who doesn't have the charisma needed to legitimately beat Boris Johnson in an election. And here's the latest YouGov polls. His approval rating has absolutely tanked since late 2020. It was hovering in at just under 50%. Clearly a very wide gap between his approval and his disapproval ratings. But by January, these narrowed. And now the gap is huge. He has a 50% disapproval rating and just a 26% approval rating. Now, there's one factor that has definitely played into this, and it's not really his fault. The vaccination program in the UK has been quite successful. I think a lot of people have reconsidered their hostility towards Boris Johnson's initial pandemic mistakes, which were many. In fact, it was a disaster. But I think in the mind of a lot of people, it's how you end the saga rather than how you begin it. And it's helping make up for all those mistakes during the first wave and even during the second wave before the vaccination effort kicked in. Still, I'm having trouble necessarily assuming that support of Boris Johnson. So if Boris Johnson's support is going up, why necessarily this is causing Keir Starmer's popularity to tank at this rate. So I think it's just because he hasn't really presented an alternative. He hasn't really given voters a reason to, what does he stand for aside from not being Boris Johnson and not being Tories? He spends more time fighting the left wing of his own party than offering any sort of ideological or policy alternative to what Boris Johnson is doing. And there's even memes about this. Basically him saying, like, I agree with Boris Johnson. So now the thing is, one doesn't have to be contrarian just for the sake of being contrarian. But even when you're agreeing, if as an opposition leader, when you're agreeing with the government, the one that you've spent a career or at least a couple of years tarnishing, you have to disagree with you have to agree, but with caveats. You have to agree sort of in the national interest, but at the same time pointing out why the ruling party doesn't have, say, a long-term view for the country. And I don't think he's doing that. And he just looks lost. His interviews, he just the sort of, he wasn't really very eloquent and very passionate before becoming leader of the opposition by any means. But I did feel that he was much more kind of forceful and engaging and sharp as well, which I see no evidence of this now. Now, Britain will not have another general election, at least in theory, until 2024, which is still a while away. But we will have some measure of whether Labour is managing to reverse its recent mishaps related to the December 2019 election in a couple of weeks, because in early May there will be a by-election in a place called Hartlepool. Now, here's the downside to this. So Hartlepool is another constituency on the Red Wall. It's on the coastal city northeast, south of Newcastle. Also, former industrial, that type of town, the type that switched Tory in 2019. And lo and behold, the Tories are winning. So I haven't seen any formal pollsters, at least apparently there is one. So a poll published last week by the Surveyation for the Communication Workers Union put the Tories in the lead by 7 points, 49% to 42%. This despite the fact that there had been a previous poll that gave Labour a slim lead. Now the bookies, and in Britain a lot of the the election, especially for small constituencies, are often the polls are really made by the betting agencies, and so Tories still have a lead, and that's kind of sad. The latest Surveyation poll will compound unease among Starmer's MPs, many of whom are concerned that his leadership is stalling. So by-elections tend to be a good kind of bellwether of public sentiment, and especially the location of Hartlepool is very important, because it really shows if Labour continues to lose seats in the Red Wall, it really tells you that the factors that led to many Red Wall constituencies flipping to the Tories, that a change in leadership did nothing. So this is really worrying, because a lot of the criticism from Corbyn was that he was too left-wing, and that if the Labour Party recovered its more center-right roots, its Blairite roots, that it had a better chance of winning, because after all, Tony Blair won 3 elections. He gave the Labour Party its longest period of rule since its inception. So the common argument is that Labour needed to move back to the center, quote, center-right, if it had any hopes of winning. And now that we have a centrist as the leader of the opposition, it kind of turns out that that's not the case. And perhaps we'll see. We still haven't had the election. I'll make another I'll speak about it when it happens. But if Hartlepool ends up flipping Tory, which apparently it hasn't had a Tory government in 50 years, there'll be a lot of questions to ask about Keir Starmer's leadership, Labour's new ideology, and whether if it was actually ideology that led to Corbyn losing, which I'm not sure it was. Rather, mistakes made by him or issues relating to his personality and his way of behaving, especially in crisis, that influenced his defeat in 2019. So, if Keir Starmer doesn't have an agenda, at least he should be better than Corbyn in this respect. At least he should have the personality of a leader and win an election against a party that deserves to be unelectable in a generation for all that they've done since 2010. That's how bad Tory rule has been for Britain. And if Keir Starmer, with all the advantages that he will now have, fails at this, if the Tories win again in 2014, it's just it would be unbelievable, like absolutely unbelievable and unforgivable. So let's see what happens in a small town on the North Sea coast on May 6th. On that note, many thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you like the content, and there will be more to come in the next few days. Thanks for listening.